Growing up, Liam and I were inseparable. In our quiet suburban neighborhood, we weren't just siblings, we were partners in every adventure. Our backyard became a whole world of possibilities. A cardboard box wasn't just a box. It was a spaceship that could take us to Jupiter. The old oak tree in the corner, that was our pirate ship, and we were the fiercest captains anyone had ever seen. Lazy Saturdays were filled with games of tag, our laughter echoing through the cul-de-sac as the sun dipped low in the sky. To everyone around us, it seemed like we were a team that nothing could break. And for a long time we were. But life has a way of pulling people apart. By the time we reached our 20s, Liam and I were on completely different paths. I went off to college, pouring every ounce of energy into internships, classes, and planning a future that felt bright and full of promise. Liam, on the other hand, hit a rough patch. A string of jobs that didn't stick. A breakup that left him reeling. He seemed adrift, struggling to figure out where he fit in a world that felt like it was moving too fast. When Liam moved back home to our cozy 2-bedroom house, it was supposed to be a temporary stop while he got back on his feet. But from the moment he walked through the door, it was clear things weren't the same. The easy laughter we'd shared as kids felt like a distant memory. Conversations were shorter, quieter, as if we didn't quite know how to bridge the gap that had grown between us. I wanted to help him, to be there for him the way I always had, but I didn't know where to start. At first, we tiptoed around each other, our routines only overlapping in small ways. I'd see him in the morning, bleary-eyed and clutching a cup of coffee, while I hurried out the door for work. In the evenings, he'd be on the couch scrolling through his phone or watching some old movie, barely acknowledging me when I walked in. It was frustrating, but I told myself to be patient. Liam was going through something, and he needed time to figure things out. Still, I missed him. The version of him who used to make me laugh until my sides hurt, who used to dream big and believe anything was possible. One evening, I decided to extend an olive branch. I came home with pizza, his favorite, and plopped down on the couch beside him. "Movie night," I offered, holding up the remote. He looked at me like I'd just spoken another language, but after a moment he nodded. "Sure." We ended up watching one of our childhood favorites, a goofy comedy that we both knew by heart. For the first time in weeks, I heard him laugh. It wasn't much, but it felt like a crack in the wall that had built up between us. From there, things started to shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly. We'd spend more time together, talking about nothing in particular. Sometimes, I'd catch him watching me with a look I couldn't quite place, but I brushed it off. He was my brother, after all. Maybe he was just grateful that I hadn't given up on him. It was during one of my evening jogs that I started to notice the change in myself. I'd made it a habit to run through the local park every night after work, a way to clear my head and shake off the stress of the day. That particular evening, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain. I just stopped near an old oak tree to catch my breath when I saw him. Liam, earbuds in, walking toward me with a look on his face that I couldn't quite place. He seemed lost, like his thoughts were heavier than usual. "Didn't know this was your spot," he said, pulling out one earbud as he stopped a few feet away. "It's a free park," I teased, trying to keep things light, but something about the way he smiled back at me made my chest tighten. We stood there for a moment, the silence filled with the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. When he touched my arm, just a quick, casual gesture as he said goodbye, I felt it linger, a warmth that stayed long after he walked away. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself that I was imagining things. But over the next few days, that moment stayed with me. Every time Liam and I crossed paths, I found myself hyper-aware of his presence. A shared laugh over breakfast felt like more than just a laugh. Sitting a little closer on the couch during movie night felt intentional. I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced when he looked at me, or the way I caught myself stealing glances when he wasn't looking. But as much as I tried to make sense of my feelings, the tension between us only grew. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending that nothing had changed. After that day at the park, things didn't settle back to normal like I'd hoped. Instead, there was this underlying tension that made every interaction feel heavier. Liam and I still did our usual things, shared jokes over breakfast, argued about whose turn it was to do the dishes, but something had shifted. I started noticing little details about him, things I'd never paid attention to before. The way his smile reached his eyes when he was genuinely happy, the quiet way he tapped his fingers when he was deep in thought. It was disorienting. One evening, we were both in the living room, binge-watching an old sitcom we used to love as kids. The laughter came easily at first, but as the episodes rolled on, I felt his gaze lingering on me longer than usual. My heart started beating faster, and I couldn't tell if it was because of him or the realization that I didn't want him to stop looking. The next morning, I decided I needed some space to clear my head. I grabbed my sneakers and headed out for a jog. The crisp air and familiar route through the neighborhood helped ease my thoughts. But as I passed the park, memories of the other night resurfaced, and with them came more questions. Was I imagining the shift between us, or was Liam feeling the same way and just as confused as I was? When I got back home, he was sitting on the porch with a mug of coffee, staring out at the street. He glanced up as I approached, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said softly, his voice carrying an unusual warmth. I nodded, suddenly self-conscious. Without another word, I went inside, but the way he looked at me stayed with me for the rest of the day. Later that week, we found ourselves alone in the kitchen, cooking dinner together. Our mom had gone out to run errands, leaving the house unusually quiet. Liam was chopping vegetables while I stirred the sauce, and for a while it felt like old times. Then, as I reached for a spice jar on the shelf above him, our hands brushed and I froze. "Sorry," I mumbled, pulling back too quickly. My cheeks burned as I tried to focus on anything but him. "It's fine," he replied, his tone neutral, but when I glanced at him, his eyes were searching mine. The moment stretched between us, charged and unsettling. Finally, he broke the silence. "Maya, is something going on with us?" I didn't know how to answer. Every instinct screamed at me to deny it, to laugh it off and move on. But the weight of unspoken feelings between us was too much to ignore. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He nodded slowly, as if he understood exactly what I meant. Neither of us said another word about it that night, but the air between us had undeniably shifted. The following days were a confusing blur. We fell into a strange rhythm, navigating the tension with unspoken rules. There were moments of closeness, like when he offered to help me with a project I was working on, or when we shared a quiet laugh over an inside joke. But just as quickly we'd pull away, retreating into our own worlds as if trying to protect ourselves from whatever was brewing. Then came the night I couldn't ignore anymore. It was late, and we were both in the kitchen, finishing up the dishes after dinner. The light above the sink cast a soft glow over the room, and the quiet of the house made every sound feel amplified. The clink of plates, the rush of water, even the steady rhythm of his breathing. As I passed him a dish to dry, our hands brushed again. This time, neither of us pulled away. My pulse quickened, and when I looked up, I found him watching me. "Liam," I started, but before I could finish, he leaned in. The kiss was soft and hesitant, like he was waiting for me to pull back. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my heart racing as the world seemed to fall away. For a brief moment, it felt like everything clicked, even though I knew how complicated this was. When we finally pulled apart, neither of us spoke. His hand lingered on mine, his expression a mix of confusion and longing. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice shaky. I shook my head, swallowing hard. "Don't be." We stood there in the quiet, the weight of what had just happened settling between us. The lines we'd carefully avoided were now undeniably crossed, and there was no going back. After the kiss, everything felt different. We didn't talk about it, but the air between us was charged in a way I couldn't ignore. Liam seemed quieter, more thoughtful, and I caught him looking at me more often, his eyes lingering just a second too long. I was doing the same, though I tried not to make it obvious. It was like we were both navigating a stormy sea, unsure of which direction to sail. One evening, a week later, Mom announced she'd be out late at a work function. It wasn't unusual, but this time, the prospect of being alone with Liam all evening made my stomach flutter. I decided to keep myself busy, retreating to my room with my laptop and headphones. Maybe some music would drown out the confusion swirling in my head. About an hour later, there was a knock at my door. "Maya, can I come in?" I hesitated. "Yeah, sure." Liam stepped in, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "Peace offering," he said with a small smile, handing one to me. "Thanks," I murmured, taking it and sitting up on my bed. He didn't leave, though. Instead, he sat down at the edge of my bed, his fingers drumming lightly on his mug. "We should talk," he finally said, breaking the silence. I took a deep breath. "About what?" He gave me a look that said he wasn't buying my act. "You know what?" Setting my mug on the nightstand, I hugged my knees to my chest. "I don't know, Liam. I don't know what to say or how to feel about all of this." "Neither do I," he admitted. "But we can't keep pretending nothing happened." I nodded, my heart thudding in my chest. "So what now?" He didn't answer right away, instead staring down into his mug like it held the answers. "I don't know. But I do know I can't go back to how things were. Can you?" His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I couldn't lie to him, not about this. "No," I whispered. The silence that followed felt deafening, but then he scooted closer, his hand brushing mine. It was such a small, innocent gesture, yet it sent a shiver through me. "We'll figure it out," he said softly, his voice steady. Together. For the rest of the night, we stayed in my room, talking about everything and nothing. We reminisced about our childhood, laughed about silly memories, and tiptoed carefully around the deeper, unspoken truths. It was comforting, in a way, to feel like we were still us, even with the added layer of complexity. Later, as he got up to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at me. "Good night, Maya." "Good night, Liam," I replied, my voice soft. But as the door clicked shut, I couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring, and whether we could keep navigating this uncharted territory without getting lost. The days melted together in a haze of furtive glances and careful distance. At school, we maintained our practiced routines, yet an invisible current seemed to pull us into each other's orbit. During lunch periods, we found ourselves gravitating closer while still keeping that necessary buffer of space, ever mindful of watchful eyes. The walk home that afternoon shifted something between us. Memories of childhood races home flooded back, simpler times when touch didn't carry such weight. Now each accidental contact felt charged with meaning. Our fingers found each other somewhere between maple trees and memory, intertwining without discussion or acknowledgement. The pressure of his hand in mine spoke volumes that words couldn't capture. As our house came into view, reality intruded, forcing our hands apart. Mom's car in the driveway served as a stark reminder of our complicated situation. The suggestion of meeting at the treehouse later came in a whispered moment before we entered the house. Our childhood sanctuary would now hold deeper secrets than board game strategies and shared comic books. The thought made my heart race with equal parts anticipation and anxiety. Dinner stretched endlessly, with Mom's work stories filling the silence between careful bites and avoided eye contact. The food held no interest as nervous energy consumed me. Finally, Mom's bedroom door closed, and the familiar sound of her television provided our cover. Midnight found me navigating familiar hallways with new purpose, avoiding the betraying creak of old floorboards. The treehouse welcomed me with soft lantern light and his waiting presence. In that small space that had witnessed so much of our shared childhood, we faced each other with the weight of adult decisions between us. The conversation flowed in whispers, addressing the complexity of our situation without truly resolving it. Uncertainty threaded through every word, yet underneath ran a current of inevitability. We weren't sure about anything anymore, except the magnetic pull between us that defied logic and convention. When we kissed this time, it wasn't the surprise of our first encounter. This was deliberate, chosen despite every reason we shouldn't. The treehouse became our sanctuary from the world below, a space where complicated feelings could exist without judgment. His hand found my face as mine gripped his shirt, closing any remaining distance between us. Under the stars, in our childhood haven, we made our choice. Whatever consequences awaited, we would face them together. The world might not understand, but in that moment, understanding seemed less important than the reality of his touch, his closeness, the shared breath between us. As we held each other, foreheads touching, the weight of our decisions settled around us. There would be no going back from this moment, this deliberate step into unmapped territory. Whether we were making the biggest mistake of our lives or following an inevitable path, only time would tell. But in the safety of our treehouse, surrounded by childhood memories and adult emotions, the future's uncertainty felt less daunting when faced together. Everything changed the night of Mom's business dinner. She had left earlier than usual, dressed elegantly in her navy suit, promising to return late. The house felt different that evening, quieter, more intimate. The usual carefully maintained distance between Liam and me had started to dissolve in the safety of our solitude. We were watching a movie in the living room, the space between us on the couch growing smaller with each passing minute, when headlights swept across the windows. The familiar sound of Mom's car in the driveway sent ice through my veins. She was home hours earlier than expected. In our panic to separate, I knocked over a glass of water, and Liam's sudden movement sent his phone clattering to the floor. The front door opened before we could fully compose ourselves. Mom stood in the doorway, her face strained and pale. Her eyes moved between us, taking in our flushed faces and guilty postures. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken revelations. Her jacket slipped from her fingers, falling forgotten to the floor. Something in her expression told me she had already known, or at least suspected. Perhaps we hadn't been as careful as we thought. Perhaps a neighbor had seen us in the treehouse, or noticed the way we looked at each other. Or perhaps a mother simply knows when something has shifted in her home. The world seemed to stop in that moment, suspended between the comfortable lies of yesterday and the harsh truths of tomorrow. Mom's hands trembled as she gripped the back of the nearest chair, her knuckles white with tension. The business dinner, we would later learn, had been cut short by an overwhelming suspicion that had driven her home early. No accusations were made that night. No voices were raised. Instead, a heavy silence filled the house as Mom retreated to her room, the soft click of her door echoing like thunder. Liam and I remained frozen in the living room, the forgotten movie still playing in the background, its cheerful dialogue a jarring contrast to our silent crisis. That night marked the end of our secret world. The treehouse would no longer be our sanctuary, and the stolen moments between classes would become memories we'd struggle to face. As I lay in bed, listening to the muffled sounds of Mom crying in her room, the weight of our choices pressed down like a physical thing. Morning would bring conversations we weren't prepared for, decisions we weren't ready to make, and consequences we hadn't fully considered. The careful bubble we'd constructed around our feelings had burst, exposing us to the harsh light of reality. Our private world had collided with the real one, and in the aftermath, nothing would ever be the same. The distance between our rooms had never felt greater, yet we were more connected than ever in our shared dread of what tomorrow would bring. Our beautiful, dangerous secret had finally caught up with us, and the cost of our choices loomed like a shadow over our future. The next morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Mom had called in sick to work, something she never did, and summoned both sets of parents for an emergency family meeting. Liam's father and stepmother arrived within the hour, their faces drawn with concern that quickly morphed into horror as Mom explained her suspicions. The living room became a battlefield of accusations and demands. Words like inappropriate, forbidden, and absolutely unacceptable filled the air. Our parents traded theories about where they had gone wrong, what signs they had missed, how this could have happened under their roof. They spoke about us as if we weren't there, sitting side by side on the couch, our hands clenched into fists at our sides. Their solution was immediate and absolute: separation. Different schools, different living arrangements, mandatory counseling, and complete supervision. Liam would go to live with his father and stepmother immediately. I would stay with Mom, but under strict new rules. No phones, no internet except for schoolwork, no going out except for classes. But something had shifted inside both of us. The fear of discovery that had haunted us for so long had finally materialized, and in its wake, we found an unexpected strength. When Liam's father grabbed his arm to lead him upstairs to pack, Liam wrenched away. My own voice surprised me as I declared I wouldn't let them separate us. The adults' shock at our defiance quickly turned to anger. They couldn't understand, or refused to understand, that their opposition only strengthened our resolve. Each threat they made, each punishment they proposed, pushed us closer together. When Mom tried to confiscate my phone, I refused to hand it over. When Liam's stepmother started listing local boarding schools, he simply walked out of the room. We retreated to our respective rooms, doors locked, communicating through text messages as chaos erupted downstairs. The parents argued among themselves about the best course of action, their voices rising and falling like waves against our doors. They tried bargaining, then threatening, then pleading through our locked doors, but we remained firm in our silence. Hours passed. The sun tracked across the sky as the adults below cycled through strategies to regain control of the situation. But they didn't understand that something fundamental had changed. The secret that had burdened us for so long had been stripped away, and in its absence, we found a peculiar kind of freedom. We had nothing left to lose. Through our phones, Liam and I made our own plans. We wouldn't run away. We weren't that naive. But we wouldn't submit to their demands either. We were both nearly 18, counting the days until we could make our own choices legally. Until then, we would endure whatever punishments they devised, but we wouldn't pretend our feelings weren't real. As evening approached, the house grew quieter. Exhaustion had set in on both sides of the battlefield. Our parents finally left us alone, retreating to discuss their next moves. Through the walls, I could hear them in the kitchen, their voices hushed but intense. They were realizing that their authority had limits, that their children had grown beyond their control in ways they never anticipated. In our separate rooms, Liam and I waited. We knew tomorrow would bring new attempts to break us apart, new strategies to make us see reason. But they had underestimated the bond between us. What they saw as teenage rebellion or manipulation was something deeper, something that had grown in the quiet moments between childhood and now, something that wouldn't break under their pressure. As night fell, our phones lit up with messages of support for each other. No matter what came next, we would face it together. Let them take away our phones, separate our rooms, send us to different schools. They couldn't change how we felt. They couldn't undo what had already grown between us. In their attempt to force us apart, they had only succeeded in proving how impossible that would be. A year can change everything, or nothing at all. In our case, it did both. The seasons had cycled through their familiar pattern. Leaves falling, snow melting, flowers blooming. But beneath these surface changes, the essential truth remained. Liam and I were still us, still together, still fighting for what we had. The past year hadn't been easy. True to their word, our parents had tried everything to separate us. Different schools, scheduled counseling sessions, monitored communications, and endless lectures about morality and family values. Liam's father had even taken a job offer in another state, trying to force physical distance between us. But distance proved meaningless in an age of secret social media accounts and burner phones. Every barrier they built, we found a way around. We were different people now. The past year had forced us to grow up faster than we'd planned. I had graduated early, taking extra classes to finish high school ahead of schedule. Liam had worked 2 jobs while completing his GED, saving every penny. We had both been accepted to universities, different ones, but only an hour apart. Not ideal, but manageable. More importantly, they were our choices, made without parental influence or interference. Our family relationships had evolved too, though not in the way our parents had hoped. Mom had slowly moved from outright opposition to reluctant acceptance, realizing that her attempts to control the situation only pushed me further away. Liam's father remained stubborn in his disapproval, but even he had begun to see the futility of fighting against our determination. The biggest change wasn't in our circumstances, but in ourselves. The secrecy that had once felt thrilling now seemed unnecessary. The shame they had tried to instill never took root. Instead, we had grown more confident in our feelings, more certain of our path. The whispers and judgments that had once terrified us now rolled off like rain. As I blew out the candle, Liam pulled out an envelope. Inside was a lease agreement for a small apartment near my future campus. It wasn't much, a studio with barely enough room for a bed and desk, but it represented everything we had fought for. Freedom, independence, a future of our own choosing. Our love story wasn't conventional. It didn't follow the neat patterns that society preferred. But sitting there in our childhood treehouse, planning our adult future, we understood something our parents had never grasped. Love doesn't always follow the expected path. Sometimes it creates its own way, breaking through barriers and redrawing boundaries. The sun was setting outside, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Soon, I would have to return to the house for the small birthday dinner Mom had planned. Liam would drive back to his father's place, maintaining the illusion of compliance for just a little while longer. But we knew these separations were temporary now. In a few months, we would begin our new life together, on our own terms. As we sat in comfortable silence, Watching the day fade through the treehouse window, I realized that the fear and uncertainty of last year had transformed into something stronger. The world had tried to tell us our feelings were wrong, but we had proven them right, not through arguments or rebellion, but through the simple persistence of love that refused to be denied. Our story wasn't ending, it was just beginning. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, just as we had faced this past year. The future stretched before us, uncertain but full of possibility, and for the first time, we were free to chase it on our own terms.